Hey, thanks everyone for coming and thanks for the introduction, Kelvin. So what I'm going to be doing is just taking you through the first step, which is the basics. Then we'll have a quick Q&A session, and then Niko will be going through some of the more analytical parts of the approach to pricing, and also finishing with some final advice on how to recognize the warning signs that you might be going towards a SaaS graveyard and what to do to avoid it. So the first thing that became wildly apparent to myself and Niko when we were planning this was the fact that you can't really look at one KPI. So if we could drill one fact home to you, when you're thinking about your pricing, please don't think about one KPI. You need to consider lots of things, usually together. The data points really reinforce each other and will help you make a stronger decision. For example, you could look at LTV and base your pricing decision solely on, well, this customer makes us this much money, so we charge that much, but you should really balance it with CAC. So for example, you should be earning about 3 times more from a customer as it costs to acquire them, as a rule of thumb. Other examples of interdependencies between KPIs and pricing are how much are you selling? If you're selling thousands and thousands of whatever it is, I don't know, movie tickets, then your customer acquisition cost can be quite low. But if you're only selling one ticket, then your customer acquisition cost will be in the thousands. So they're slightly inversely proportionate. The other thing is the relationship between how much you spend to acquire the customer and how much it costs to actually get them to start generating an income. So you might spend very little money getting a customer in the door, but there's a very hidden cost after they convert. They might need a lot of follow-up care or help onboarding. And then the other examples are billing frequency. So are you charging annually? Are you charging monthly? That in turn will affect your net revenue retention, as every time that you renew a contract, it's a chance to renew it for a slightly higher amount. The first thing I wanted to shock you with is the fact that you can't just look at one thing. It's not that simple. You have to look at many things in conjunction, and Niko will be going into some of those later on. So having said that, if we had to distill it down to its simplest essence, you can either increase your prices and find a better quality ideal customer profile. What we mean by better quality is that they have a higher lifetime value, so you earn more from them over the course of the relationship. You either have more revenue per month from them, or as they progress throughout their life cycle with you, you can increase your invoicing amounts. That's what a quality ideal customer profile is. The flip side to that is you can also decrease your prices and find a cheaper ideal customer. So that means that you're going to go for higher volume and lower customer acquisition costs. The SaaS graveyard exists in between those two extremes. And sorry, just one last thing. What everyone tries to do is they try to increase the price and find a cheaper ICP, which is just like, it's like hunting unicorns. It's nigh on impossible, just because it costs money to make content to attract customers. And when you attract customers through that kind of a channel, it's not cheap. We'll look into that, why it's impossible to increase the price and find a cheaper ICP later. So let's go to next slide. The basics. First thing you need to figure out is, how are you going to charge? There's 4 main pricing models, and each pricing model really depends on the type of thing that you're selling. Besides the 4 main pricing models, there's 3 main business models. So that would be self-service, transactional, and enterprise. And again, the pricing models do fit different business models. For example, self-service is usually cheaper. So what you charge the end user is usually less, but it's harder to sell when you have a minimum viable product. So Self-service, you charge less because the customer is meant to take the responsibility of getting themselves into the system. That's harder to do when you don't have an onboarding flow built yet, especially in an early stage. So the first thing is that self-service very rarely suits startups that are just launching. It's very rare that a product is simple enough to use. The second business model is custom onboarding. So you have much better conversion because you literally hold the customer's hand the entire way through the journey. But that is associated obviously with a higher cost. So self-service is usually focused on inbound marketing, and you need a strong number of transactions to support that. To generate all these transactions, it requires a lot of early burn. And when you're burning that much money, you really need to be sure that those customers are converting and not just being lost. For that reason, self-service really has to fit your pricing, because if the pricing is too low and people aren't converting, you're going to end up in the SaaS graveyard. The other thing is that companies at a very early stage that offer self-service usually aren't ready for the type of scaling required to sustain that business model. The flip side is enterprise. So the price should reflect the complexity of the product and the value provided. If you're providing a super valuable product and charging too little for it, obviously everyone wants to buy it. But very often the complexity involved with getting set up means that there's a hidden cost, usually in the customer service or customer success side. Okay, a lot of information so far. I'm going to take a little breath and we go to the next slide, which is visually much, much simpler. So there are four main pricing models. There's the flat price, there's usage-based, there's seat-based, and there's tiered. There's also an honorable mention, which is basically feature-based. So feature-based pricing can kind of be added on. You can kind of add feature-based pricing to each of the above models, which is why it's not a standalone one. In fact, tiered pricing is basically just where you create buckets of features that you charge for, where the top tier is the most features and the bottom tier is the most limited amount of features. For example, flat pricing really suits self-service because it's simple, it has better conversion. Usage-based usually is, you'll see that more in enterprise. And seat-based, again, it could be either, and tiered is most common for self-service again. And it's completely possible that you have a flat price product that you add features onto. For example, you go to a restaurant, you order a baked potato. The baked potato has a fixed price of €3. And then when you add bacon or cream or whatever you want onto it, the price goes up. Usage-based is the same. You pay for what you use, and then you can add more features onto it to get a better experience. And it's the same with all the rest. So that's just to frame the discussion that we talk about pricing models and we talk about business models. And depending on your company, you will have a unique mix of both of these. Next slide. So how much should you charge? If it's your first day in the job and you have a brand new shiny product, you need to figure out how much you're going to charge for it. The simpler and clearer your pricing, the more you're going to sell. It's super easy to buy a pair of socks for $5. It's less easy to buy a pair of socks that you think cost $37, but you're not sure because you have to pay for each step that you take in them. And ultimately, you're not sure if it charged $14 or $53. So the simpler the pricing, the simpler the communication. And when the communication is simpler, there's more trust and you're going to sell more. So what we would recommend is to start with 1 to 3 price points for your minimum viable product. If you're past MVP stage, chances are you already have a pricing model that you're working with. And if you only have the one price point, we would recommend adding a lower and higher price point. How do you get this price point? You estimate your customer acquisition cost. In your very, very first days, you're just going to have to take a stab at it. Even past your first couple of months, in business, your customer acquisition cost is going to be insanely high and won't mean that much actually. But somehow you need to come up with an estimate for how much it will cost you to acquire a customer. What you're going to do is multiply it by 3, because like we said at the beginning of the talk, ideally you should be earning 3 times more from a customer as it costs to acquire them. And then you're going to divide that magic number by 12, and that will give you a monthly price. So you've estimated your CAC, you've multiplied it by 3, and you divided it by 12. You take this number and you look at what your competitors are doing. Are they charging more? Are they charging less? Are you right bang in the middle? That will give you an idea of your market positioning, which is an important part of your go-to-market strategy. For your minimum viable product, it is better and it's completely okay to undercharge and to make a loss while you're validating market fit and the various features that you're offering. The important part is that while you're making that loss, you're learning from it. And you need to gather data on your ideal customer profiles, maybe look at what price point they're converting on, what price point they're converting at, and adjust accordingly. Niko is going to go into that a little bit later in more detail. And next, how much will I sell? Once you find this initial pricing, you can start building a sales forecast. So you will, with the initial pricing, you can figure out how much you need to sell. And based on how much you need to sell, you will be able to figure out what pricing models will suit you best. You should already have your business model. The pricing model usually comes after the business model. So again, super simple. Self-service favors inbound marketing. So that means you're going to be creating content. You're going to be spending money on advertising on Instagram, LinkedIn, Google Ads. You're going to be maybe generating partnerships and content like that. Whereas for enterprise, it's going to favor outbound account-based selling, which means you're going to have to employ a sales team. You're probably going to have to employ someone to help handle the reporting and the volume of data, maybe someone to do lead researching. A lot of it can be automated with tools, but those are the 2 directions you can go. There is the third one, which is transactional based, and that's kind of a mixture of self-service and enterprise. One thing to remember, hybrid companies are the most at risk of ending up in the SaaS graveyard. So that is companies that offer a freemium model, or they offer a self-service model, and they also offer an enterprise model. Niko is going to go into the details of that later with some CAC payback charts, and you can see exactly why it is that hybrid companies are most at risk. But yeah, if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I do a little bit of both, I do a little bit of self-service, we do a little bit of enterprise, pay attention, because yeah, you're statistically at risk of ending up in the SaaS graveyard. Another thing is that your billing process should scale from 10 to 100 and from 100 to 1,000 customers without adding lots of new people or resources. So you need to get that built from day one once you decide on the pricing model. And you need to make sure that your financial tech stack can handle the volumes if you're going for self-service. So can you literally handle thousands of customers a day paying you? Or you need to be able to handle unique billing situations if you are doing enterprise and outbound sales. So the customer wants this, this, and this, but they don't want this, this, and this part. How do you charge them for it? Is the pricing clear enough to facilitate that? And that was a super quick run through of the basics of pricing and kind of sets the stage for looking at some examples in the next round.
Yes. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Cameron, for the for starting the webinar with the pricing basics. So let's now assume that you have your first results, you have data, you've talked to a lot of different customers, you've gotten feedback, etc. So now it's time to analyze that data and then react to that and make pricing experiments. So basically, you've had some assumptions in the past. You might still have some assumptions. So now it's time to act and then make some changes and either increase your prices, find another ICP, or decrease your prices. So there's a lot of ways to go. But very important thing is that based on your segments or based on your ICPs or based on your plans, analyze if one of them has had a lot of traction. And then if some haven't had traction and some have not, try to analyze why is the case. If no one is buying a particular part of your product, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe your highest price point is not interesting enough for your customers, for example. So basically interview your customers, try to get direct feedback, and then maybe your some add-ons are just way too raw, they are not developed enough, and maybe the price is too high. In some cases, the price might also be too low. When you're talking to more mature customers and companies, they might think that no, this is not a good product because the price is too low. That might happen as well. And most cases, your ICP is just wrong. You're talking to the wrong people. You're selling to the wrong people. So you're not adding any value, and the ICP doesn't need your proposition. Basically, they're not getting any value out of that. So that's often the case, but then you just need to analyze it and figure out why it is the case. Sometimes also the sign-up process is just way too complicated. Basically the prospect might just drop off during the sign-up process or the self-serve onboarding process. They cannot figure out what is the problem or what you're trying to solve there. And here's two scenarios that we often see. So sometimes most of your sales actually happen in your lowest price point. And if this happens, you need to probably decrease your prices overall and then build an upselling path from a lower price point so that you can then convert customers at a later stage and build a net revenue retention, which is more than 100%. Or then you might need to change your ICP as well. You might be selling to the wrong customers. The other end of the spectrum is that if all your sales are happening on your highest price points, then you most likely need to do some testing and double your prices, triple your prices for certain segments and see how they react to those. And maybe you need to reshuffle your pricing model and then have a higher starting price and then build add-ons on top of that. That's one thing to consider. But often startups start with too low a price. That's what we've seen, and often they double or triple their prices within the first and second year based on the feedback and based on the evolution of the product. And especially if you have B2B companies, often it is better to have an overall higher price list and then offer certain discounts for earlier stage companies, say 80% for very small companies or 50% discounts, etc. So then you can more experiment with the higher price point and try to figure out what is the maximum price that you can charge for a certain ICP. Because trust me, nobody's going to pay more than what you're asking. Therefore, it's better to ask more so that you get more also if you're talking to the right ICP. Let's go to the next slide. Basically experimenting. A couple of points to consider. If your pricing analysis and experiments happen based on the examples that we went through earlier, it must be that you're on the right track, and then you just need to continue experimenting, then probably tweaking up the price little by little, and then charge more, add more add-ons and see what sells and what doesn't sell. And then upselling path is extremely important to build into your pricing model, even from day one, if you can, because at Series A, it impacts your valuation and the size of your funding round enormously. If you can show, for example, 120% net revenue retention, 150%, 200%, you have a huge valuation difference compared to, say, 70% or 90% net revenue retention. So try to capture customers at a little bit lower price point and then make sure that the price that you basically sell to them increases over time and increases on the second year, third year, and so on. That is key to a higher valuation overall. And how to accomplish this is that tweak your ICP all the time, build cohort analysis, sell with a different price to different markets, different price to different ICPs, different cohorts overall, and try to see what works so that you can actually build the upselling path easier and then tweak your prices with a fast scale. And this means that you have to start pricing experiments very early on, because it's not easy. It will take some time. It will take basically time to build the finance stack needed and the marketing stack needed. So the more data you have and the easier price experiments you have, and the more often you can have them, the better, because then you're on the right path to have more stable pricing later on and the upselling path as well. So start experimenting early and interview a lot of people. The more direct feedback you get, the better. Let's go to the next slide. So let's look at the three most common SaaS sales models based on the complexity of selling and complexity of onboarding the customer, which is the lower axis over there, and then based on the amount that you sell, the price that you ask for the service, and it goes from low to high on the left-hand side. And basically, if we think about two opposite ends of the spectrum, there's self-serve on the bottom left corner, and then there's enterprise on the top right corner. Self-serve is relatively easy. If you think about annual contract values, it is usually less than $2,000 a year. Usually means high volumes, very low CAC, self-serve onboarding, and it's super easy to buy and use the product and get yourself onboarded. And it means that you basically can have a super efficient marketing done and reach high volumes, because the volume just justifies the low price. And the opposite end of the spectrum is enterprise. So it means that you have a complex product to use. It adds a lot of value. It's hard to sell. Sales cycles are long, and then onboarding process is really long. And you probably have very small amount of volume as well, but you're charging a huge amount of money. Your annual contract value might be more than 100,000 per customer, for example, as opposed to self-serve, which is usually less than 2,000 a year. These are really different models to begin with, whereas the transactional sales model is somewhere in between. So transactional means that you have often a lot of volume, like self-serve. Your CAC is probably higher because often you're combining marketing and outbound sales and assisted onboarding. But then the price is often higher, which means that often the self-serve companies have evolved the transactional model where they actually give a lot of value to their customer that justifies the higher price, but they have managed to build a very efficient onboarding flow, and it requires just a little bit of assisting of the customer. So it basically often move from the bottom left quadrant from self-serve to transactional, and then you maybe try to have some enterprise plans in transactional companies, or then you go directly to enterprise model and you only target the customers from day one. So these are the usual three different SaaS models, and they have very different annual contract values and monthly versus annual payment cycles, and very different volumes as well. And the one that you want to avoid is the SaaS Graveyard, which is in the bottom right corner. Usually it means that you have very high CAC. It's really complex to sell to the customer. You have high onboarding fees, and it's a very complex product, but you're charging too little for the product. So the annual contract value is very low. You're asking maybe just a monthly payment for your customers, but you have huge upfront fees. So it means that you cannot scale because you don't have enough money, and then you cannot just justify it from a cash flow point of view. So you want to move out of the graveyard mode. And then most companies actually, when they start, they are in the SaaS Graveyard. So you just have to figure out which direction do you go. Do you go towards self-serve, transactional, or enterprise? But then you have to get out of there, because otherwise it's a graveyard basically, and you end up being there. But just let me be clear: most companies start from there, find a way out of there. Let's go to the next slide, and we are talking about basically giving you a couple of practical examples so that this becomes a little bit more clear with some numbers and charts. So let's look at self-serve first as an example. So here, as we discussed previously, there's usually a low CAC. There is no customer support costs because it's self-serve. High volumes, inbound marketing, and usually a very easily understandable flat price model. In this example, we've used the CAC of $600, no customer support fees. It's a 3-year relationship. LTV is 1,800, and the customer pays monthly $50. And on the right-hand side, if you look at the cumulative cash flows and the profitability of one single customer, in the beginning, on month 1, you're out of pocket by $600. So you have to figure out how to finance that somehow. As time goes by and the customer pays that $50 a month, on month 13, actually the customer becomes profitable. And this means it's profitable from a CAC and onboarding costs point of view. And because the LTV to CAC ratio is 3, and the CAC and onboarding payback time is 13 or 12 months, this is a fairly healthy option, and the last 2 years of the customer contract are actually positive, and you're earning some money, and cumulative cash flows are healthy. So this is fine. So let's go to the next model, and let's look at enterprise model. And this is another example of a healthy model with healthy numbers here. So here you have quite a high CAC because your sales cycle is quite long. You might have some sales engineers participating in convincing the customer to buy, and when the customer signs up, there's high customer support costs. Usually the process is quite long. You acquire your customers with outbound marketing. The customer pays annually. Usually very low volume of deals. You might just have a handful or a couple of dozen customers. And often you have a tiered pricing model, which is based on usage or some other way. So according to this example, we've estimated that the CAC is $5,000 and the customer success fees are $2,000. LTV, it's 5 years. Here in this case, $60,000, and an annual price that the customer pays upfront is $12,000. So according to this example, you're immediately out of pocket by $7,000. So your CAC and your onboarding fees sounds a lot of money, but because you charge annually upfront, then your cumulative cash flows are basically immediately when the customer pays, it's 5,000 positive, which is perfect. And then, so you don't get any money from your customer for the next months until you hit the 13th month, and you charge again the 12,000. And you have some annual customer success fees on that. But then, hey, your cumulative cash flows are 15,000 positive until you hit 24 months. It's quite nice. So this is healthy. LTV to CAC is high, and annual cash flows and cumulative cash flows are healthy. I'd consider this a healthy business model, maybe not super scalable, but from a profitability and cash flow point of view, it's perfect. Let's go to the next slide, and let's look at the graveyard model. So it's basically taking some examples from the previous slide. Usually the graveyard model means that you have too high CAC. LTV to CAC is not great. You have high customer support costs. You're trying to reach customers with a little bit of this and a little bit of that, then you might not know your ICP. You ask for monthly payment from your customers, and you might have a high volume of transactions. And in this example, we've used a CAC of 600 and customer support costs in the beginning of 1,000. LTV, well, 3-year deal basically, or 3-year relationship, 1,800, and the customer pays monthly 100. Well, this example means that you're immediately out of pocket by 1,600. And little by little, the customer pays, and then on the 16th month, the CAC and the onboarding fees have been paid back. And then basically you go until the end of the contract, you don't get a lot of money to justify the basically the cash flows that you've already paid out. So this I would not consider a great deal, even though the LTV to CAC is okay. The CAC and onboarding payback time is not great, and it's a monthly deal where you have high customer support costs. This basically should have one-off onboarding fee charged to the customer, and most likely annual fees charged to the customer as well. Otherwise, this is not supportable, because then you cannot scale this. You probably don't have enough money to scale and build a profitable business, probably run out of time. So I would say that this is not a good option. This is a graveyard example here. Let's go to the next slide, and then let's talk about a couple of practical tips how to avoid the SaaS graveyard. So if you have assisted onboarding, try to bill annual upfront fees from your customer to justify the amount of time that you spend with them, and try to bill a one-off onboarding fee as well. Because when the people pay that, they feel more locked in, they feel like they're engaged, and so on. Even if you don't have to bill that, try to have a one-off fee so it kind of locks in customers. That's usually a good trick. Most important thing is that you know your ICP really well. If you know your ICP, you know what their pain points are, you know what kind of solution they're looking for, you know what they're willing to pay for it, and you know what kind of value you're giving them. So this is the most important thing. And then you can find the right kind of pricing point for them. Next thing to consider is that you have to build an upselling path to your pricing very early on to have a positive net revenue retention. Even if you're not looking for funding, you basically want to have more revenue later on from the same customer. So try to figure out how you can do that. How can you add more value in the customer relationship, and how can you charge more? Next thing to consider is that if your product is not self-serve, and if you don't target masses, do not have self-serve prices. Try to figure out how you can bill more, and how can you charge annual upfront payments rather than having very small monthly fees. And in any case, try to automate your onboarding as much as possible with really good knowledge base articles, a really good onboarding flow built into your product, and then make buying always really easy. If possible, try to have the customer sign up automatically and then start using a freemium model, for example, or have a free trial in your product. Make using your product and buying your product really easy. The fewer friction and thresholds you have, the more you will be able to sell as well. I touched this point a little bit earlier, like non-recurring revenue versus recurring revenue, like one-off fees that you charge for onboarding. Those are usually really good, but the ratio of one-off to recurring revenue should be healthy as well, because you want to display a high MRR and regular MRR development as well. So instead of, for example, charging a high one-off fee, bill annually and bake your one-off fees into the annual price so that you can have a higher MRR as well. And so try to depend on a recurring revenue, because that's something constant that comes to you no matter what, basically. So key takeaways here. You should constantly change your pricing regularly in the first couple of years, so that you know how much your ICPs are willing to pay. And you're basically refining your ICP at the same time. And pricing experience are very normal and very healthy. And like Cameron said in the beginning, never look at any single thing in isolation. So don't look at just your price and your LTV. Look at your onboarding fees. Look at your volumes. Look at your CAC. For example, look at your upselling path. Like, how can you lock in a customer at a very low price and then build it from there, and then kind of increase your pricing. So all in all, look at the big picture, all the different indicators, and nothing in isolation. And also do a lot of segmentation and try to figure out what is selling and why it is selling, and can you have a lower CAC for certain segments and certain markets or certain plans, and then still keep your prices steady or increase them. So segmentation and price experiments are really important, and do competitor analysis as well. That's important. But ICP, and experimentation. That's my key suggestion basically here.